Welcome, everyone. We are, on behalf of the American Institute of Professional Geologists, welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is Cognition Guided Learning in the Geosciences. This webinar has been developed by Professors Steve Reynolds and Julia Johnson, both from the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University. My name is Anna Sutton, and I'm coming to you from the Chicago area. I currently serve as the AIPG Illinois Indiana section president, and I also chair AIPG's National Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I'm going to serve as a moderator during today's webinar, and I'll quickly cover some introductory material and then turn the presentation over to our speakers. So just a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is 1 hour, and we are recording the event, and you'll be able to view it on YouTube later. You will be able to download today's presentation slides, if that's correct, Steve and Julia.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll get those onto the AIPG website in the members only resources tab, and I'll throw a couple of these links into the chat. We look forward to your questions and feedback throughout today's webinar. You are welcome to send in a question anytime using the chat box or raise your hand during the Q&A session at the end. In some cases, we'll get right back to you with an answer. In other cases, we may put the question to today's speakers at the end of the presentation. For those of you that are new to the Institute, more information about AIPG is available on our website, which is aipg.org. We have lots of great info there, including details on the 60th anniversary national conference that's coming up next month in Covington. And there's a job board and a calendar of all of our upcoming AIPG events. So check out all the goodness on the website. If you'd like to become more involved in AIPG, please reach out to me or any of the contacts you find on the website. We'd love to have you join us. And now I'm excited to turn over today's presentation to our speakers, Steve Reynolds and Julia Johnson. Thank you for joining us, Steve and Julia.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. So, and we have built in, Anna, we built in places in the talk for what we call a consolidation break to help people kind of think about what they've learned. And that's a good time for people to then put questions in the Q of A or the chat, but it's really hard for us to monitor the chat while we're doing this presentation. So if you could just, if there's a question you think needs to be answered at that point, you know, just tell us and we'll try to answer it.
Can do. Thanks, guys. Okay.
All right. So we're going to shut off our video, but we're here. All right. We've been doing a lot of research and literature research on cognition, and it's one of those things that as a university professor you almost never get taught how to teach or how students learn, and we didn't like that. And so we got very heavily into cognition and did our own research and also just figured out what other people had done. And so you will note that this presentation has, it might have one bullet list in it, but we're not big fans on bullet lists, and you'll see why. And the way it's going to work, the right window, is that both Julie and I will give this thing as we go along. Me more in the first half and her in the second half. I'd like you to first look at this picture of the Henry Mountains and think about how the geology affects the life of the cows. There's some cows and horses down in here, and we'll come back and visit this this image in another context. But if you're in a room with somebody else, share with each other what you think, all the ways that geology influences the life in the cows. And Julie and I will just be quiet for a second while you do that. So there are a lot of things you could say. You know, first of all, where are the cows and where are there no cows? There are no cows up on this slope. because it would be hard for them to stand. And Julie always makes the joke that they would be lean beef if they were there. But they're down here because it's flat. So geology, the topography is influencing them. They're down here because there's grass. There's grass down there because there's water down there. Looks like pretty dry country. So you can imagine that's being irrigated. And the cows kind of like being where the food is and other things. So there's a lot of other things we could get into, but we'll come visit this picture again. So cognitive research that people have done indicates that we have two subsystems in our brain, one for pictures and one for words. And each one of those has a limited amount of what's called working memory. Think of short-term memory plus the little processing space that is required to process short-term memory. And so one is each side of that system can only kind of hold a certain amount, and it takes information to reconcile images and words. But as we'll see, if you can integrate images and words, it's much stronger learning. And we envision, a lot of this is stuff we talk to professors about, and it has implications for teaching. But a lot of you have employees that you're trying to train and teach them how to learn. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today will be really useful when you're thinking about how to train your employees or yourself. So we're going to start with this hint. I'm going to give you a list of words, and I want you to memorize the words in order, rehearse them, and if there's somebody next to you, turn and repeat the list to them. If you're by yourself, you'll have to talk to your cat or the window or whatever. Okay, so you're going to try to get these words in order. Okay, try to repeat those out loud. So if we're in person, I would ask for a show of hands of how many you could do that. I suspect most of you could do that. In this case, what made it easier, they were short words, they were familiar things, they were the same kinds of things, and you probably noticed that Julie and I put those in a increasing size order, okay? And there were 7 of them. The people that do research on this talk about the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, and that you can kind of hold 7 things in your short-term memory and hold it there. But if you start adding more things into your short-term memory, you have to start ejecting some of the other ones in order to hold the new ones, or the new ones just pass right through and you held on to the 7 that are already there. And 7 plus or minus 2, because if they're longer words, it's harder. If they're shorter words, you might be able to do 9. There's a lot of people say that this magic number 7 plus or minus 2 is why phone numbers minus the area code are 7 numbers. Okay, I've got another list for you. We'll do the same thing. So I'll show you the list. You're going to try to put them into your brain, and then I'll make them go away and you'll try to rehearse them. In in-person presentations, there's much laughter at this point. I'm not going to make you do it. So you could imagine that your brain probably hurt on that one. And the reason is that I've just overrun your cognitive buffers, how much you could hold in your short-term working memory. And those, they were long words. They were totally unrelated. If we go back and look at them, they're unrelated. Some of them are 3 or 4 syllable. It just goes on. And so it turns out that's really hard to do. And so that's where the -2 comes in with 7. So anyway, so limited working memory limits how much you can learn. It also means then you have to have time to consolidate your knowledge and process it and get it from short term memory, working memory, into long-term memory. And there are some studies that people have done about how good your short-term memory is and how it correlates with learning. Not all is lost. I have really bad short-term memory, working memory, but I'm a professor, so it must have worked out okay. So when you're designing materials for people to learn, like employee training materials, you should have it in chunks. So Julie and I write textbooks. We've written Exploring Geology, Exploring Earth Science, and Exploring Physical Geography textbooks for McGraw-Hill. And I'm going to just show you some examples, because we took these lessons from cognitive research and said, how would you write a textbook that takes into account this? And one of the things we did is all of those books are 2-page spreads. If you're going to learn about caves, you're going to learn it in two pages here. If there's more than will fit on 2 pages, then it's 2-page spreads, but each one has its own topic. And then we also broke it out into sections. So this is a complete cognitive load approach to how you would put together training materials. Is you have to have sections. We have no long columns of text in our textbook. We don't believe in it. We don't think people learn well from it. We know that's how we all learned when we were younger. But we've had so many instructors say, "Oh, I wish I'd had this textbook when I was going to class." So, okay, so that's the first consolidation break. I promised you would have a chance to think about it. So take a second and think about the issues of cognitive load and how it might impact what you do in your own career, job, fun, whatever. And if there are any questions, Anna will interrupt us and tell us about them.
Folks are thinking at the moment. That is quite striking, the difference between the layout of your textbook and what I recall learning from.
Oh, yeah.
And it certainly looks more approachable.
Yeah.
And a lot of students really like this textbook because they have only small chunks of time. And so they take that opportunity to read a single 2-page spread in between classes and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if there's no questions, we'll keep going. And
one more.
Okay, go ahead.
Chris Lilac says, how many words do you use underneath photos to explain them?
It depends what you're trying to do. It depends how many concepts are in those words. If you're saying, this is a fault and this is what kind of fault it is, and the movement on the fault is shown by the separation between the layers and maybe some drag folding along the fault, there's only like 4 concepts in there. So we're a little less worried about the number of words as opposed to the number of things you're trying to have the student learn in the case of students. That's a good question, though. And
one more question.
Yeah.
I Lopez says, are there any exercises to increase the size of the cognitive load one can carry?
Oh, some people ask me that, and I'd say the research is contradictory. It seems like it's a lot of your ability to, how much short-term memory you have. A lot of that is what you're born with. But some people think you can kind of train yourself a little bit. It's mostly about concentration. I mean, I think one of the reasons my short-term memory is bad, I'm pretty easily distractible. Julia's nodding her head. There's a squirrel over there and I can see it. And so I think it depends on concentration, and it depends on what you inherently have. Okay.
And John Jens mentions the images are great, but they seem to break up the text. My first reaction to it, but pictures are always great. Do we find that some people look first to the text and some people look first to the images?
We will show you some research we did on that. So that's a very good question. We want the images to break up the text because the research really clearly shows that if you have long columns of text and you keep reading and reading with no breaks, you know, you start overrunning your cognitive buffers and you zone out. You keep reading, but there's nothing going in there. And so we want the figures to break up the text. In our textbooks, the typical textbook maybe has 1,000 figures or something like that in it, geology intro college textbook. Ours have like 2,600, because we think anything you're talking about, you ought to have a picture of. And so in our case, we want that. So we take it as a great compliment that our figures broke up the text.
Plus, we use leaders that go from the text to the figure to show exactly the part of the figure that you need to concentrate on when you're reading that particular text block.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few things. So watch where you look when I show you this next slide. Try to see what your brain does to this image. Monument Valley, Permian Deshay sandstone on the top. So we think what your brain does with this, as expert geologists, is you do this. We think you take that scene and you're not paying attention to every single little item in it. You're categorizing things. You're saying, oh, there's fractures, there's layers, there's loose material, talus down here on the slopes. And you treat that as one object. You're not paying attention to every little stone that's out here. And so this process of taking a complicated scene and extracting the most important stuff is a process called disembedding. It's like you're extracting, you're disembedding the signal from the noise. And we do that, but we rarely train our associates or students to do it. But I tell you, Julie and I do it. We're very explicit about these kinds of things. And then once you've thought about this scene in the context of disembedding and what kind of, you know, what's the array of features that are in here, then you can't unsee it. You know, now when you see this thing, you just see it as one big pile of stuff. Okay, one of the things that helps us disembed is figures can help us really disembed things. So either you have a geologic photograph and you've made an overlay onto it that points out what the features are, but you show the original unaltered photograph, and then below it you show kind of an overlaid version that has, you know, you're pointing out features. Turns out the globes also for global patterns really help a student disembed, because you can only look at one hemisphere at a time. So like in this case, we're looking at the hemisphere that includes the Americas. And so you could say, you know, what are the humidity patterns in here? And this is specific humidity. And what are the humidity patterns in here? And you can kind of see, you know, where it's going to rain, where it's not going to rain. We're up here. You know, so things like that help you kind of isolate a part at a time, or if it's a really complicated scene, you kind of focus on one part of it at a time. If it's a map, you focus on one part of it at a time. And so we think disembedding is a really underappreciated skill in the geosciences. And like I could bring up movies here, I'm not going to do it, that show these are satellite images of sea surface temperatures. And so you can, you know, see kind of where it's warm and where it's not. And we could have brought up different globes down here to do that kind of stuff. And then we have some words to help an instructor to remind what to say. Okay, another thing that happens when we look at images or maps, photographs, landscapes, geochemical plots, our existing knowledge really affects what we see and what our mind does with it. And so take a look at this image, also from Monument Valley, and think about how the landscape evolves in here. So this scene is a perfect example of what Julie and I call trading location for time. We're both structural geologists, and so when the people did rock deformation experiments, they use temperature to speed things up. So they would talk about that, trading temperature for time. And in this case, we think it's trading location for time. And I think all of us could see this and realize that this hill here probably looked like this, and this once was part of a mesa like this. And so you can either kind of infer what things used to look like, or you can infer how things will evolve with time. At some point, part of this mesa will become isolated and it'll make another butte. At some point, the Deshay sandstone will be eroded off the top, and this butte will evolve into a little round hill. And so it's going back and forth. But it's something that our prior knowledge influences how we look at things. It's not just like looking at a landscape. Your brain starts building these evolutionary sequences back and forth, or does other things with it.
I have family members and students who would look at this image and see a totally different thing than me, and they would have no idea why they were like they were or what might have happened to form them that way. So it's part of the, you got to be exposed to these things before you can figure them out.
So in our textbook, we actually talk about it. And I built this little 3D model that I eroded down and made it look like that. And so it really, and I've had these images, I did these images a long time ago. And then I happened to find this one place in Monument Valley that had kind of exactly what I was talking about with trading location for time. Okay, so we've just given you a couple things about disembedding trading location from time and how much your prior knowledge affects what you see. So think about it for a second. And if you have questions, put them in the chat box or the question and answer.
None yet, but that scene does remind me, my brother was on a tour with his motorcycle guys through the Southwest one time, and he just calls me. He's like, "What am I looking at?" And he shows me the picture.
Yeah.
I had to explain to him how mesas and buttes work.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 Now
Oh,
don't
Chris,
write them, but Julie and I are working on a new roadside geology of Arizona book, and it does this kind of stuff. It's still a year plus out. So don't write Mountain Press. They always get mad at us when people write them and say, "Is this book out yet?" So do not do that. Promise.
Hey, Chris had a couple of questions here. Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, but in that book, we take this kind of figure-based approach. It's a really different roadside geology book compared to anything that's been done. And it really just says, if I drive down this road, what do I see? So in the same kind of manner we're just talking about. Okay, so questions?
Yeah, Chris says, do we teach geology students how to look at things and categorize things like you described, or is it in their DNA?
We teach them how to do it. We have found that nearly every student can figure this stuff out. There's some students who just don't care enough to do anything, and they're just, lost souls. But yeah, no, we think that this kind of specific training, we train students about trading location for time. We have a bunch of slides that we show students that talks about what are the components of this landscape. And so we think it's all trainable, and but it takes specific, intentional training to do it.
One of my goals in when I teach geology intro classes, most of the students have never once stopped to think about the geology around them. Even though we live in the Phoenix Valley and there are quote unquote mountains around, they've never stopped to think about it. So you do have to teach them how to look at things, and we practice that every day in class when we meet.
Yeah, and I have to say, when either Julie or I teach classes, we both have taught lots of big intro classes, like 200 something students. And the very first thing I do in class is I show them that Henry Mountain slide that I showed you at the very start, because they don't realize that geology affects their lives. And it's an analogy. How geology affects the cows' lives is analogous with how geology affects their lives. We build our houses in specific places. There are places that aren't safe. There are places that have resources, and so, so we start with that slide. We don't start with, let's talk about the syllabus. We say, let's give, and also we want to set the tone for students that this is an active class, that they're going to be doing things. They're going to have consolidation breaks. They're going to be making observations and explaining it to the person next to them. we, as instructors, we call that a think, pair, share. So you let the student look at something, and then, and then they pair up, and then they share what they've seen. And that builds the student's confidence. And that actually lets you have a lot more confidence, a lot more discussion. The other thing that I could have mentioned, or sometimes I mention, is there are these two kinds of questions. There's something called a convergent question, and that is like, what's the age of the Pennsylvania Permian boundary? There's like one answer at any given time, and the students know that the instructor knows the answer, and that there's a large number of wrong answers. So it's a really high risk proposition for students to answer that kind of a question in class. Whereas the question I asked you about the Henry Mountains was a divergent question. People call them open-ended. And it's like, how does geology influence the life of the cows? It's not like there's a right answer to that. There might be some wrong answers, but you're just asking, what do you think? What do you observe? What are some ideas you have about this? And so if you want to have discussion in a setting, whether it's in a brainstorming session, or a training session, or in a classroom, if you ask divergent questions and let students have a little bit of time with the think, pair, share to kind of compare notes, you can have a way better discussion. Okay.
Tony asked, does color affect our ability to disassemble?
I don't know there's any research on that. It's a very good question, but I don't know the answer.
And John Jens mentions, in teaching photo stereo, we used overlays to break out the environment. Learning to do that totally changed how I taught geology to non-geology students.
Oh, there you go. Yep, we hear you. You're talking to the choir. Okay, so, well, it turns out I was the first geoscientist to have his own eye tracking setup. And so what an eye tracker does, the little box below shines light, not bright lights, but infrared, stuff like that, in your eyes, and we can tell where you're looking on that computer screen. And so we did a series of experiments, students that Julie and I supervised. And here's one of them. And I'm just going to show you the results. So this is a case where we took a scene, and we either had the scene without people or dogs or hot air balloons or dune buggies, whatever in it, no human things in it. And we showed the students showed half the students that scene, and then another half got this scene where we actually photoshopped these climbers in. This is the little Colorado River Gorge. There's no way a climber could ever get there. But so we photoshopped them in. And if the climbers were there, the distractor, the students paid a lot of attention to the climbers and their route, and they did not look around as much. Whereas if there weren't people in the scene, the students surveyed the scene. This was an animation where we were talking about joints. And so you would think the students would be looking around at all the fractures, and they do that. Here's a famous geologist, Ivo Lukita. He and I were out in the field in the Buckskin Mountains, the Lincoln Ranch reverse fault. And you can see that they looked at Ivo's face a ton, and they looked at where Ivo was looking. And also you see they tend to look right in the center of the screen. So if something's important, if you can get it at the center of the screen, you're better off. But they also looked at, he's got red shoelaces, and they looked down and spent some amount of time looking at his red shoelaces. If we photoshopped Ivo out, because he was there when I took the picture, then the students go up and down the fault that we're describing. They still spend a lot of time in the center, but it's better. So we know that we've always, for decades, for generations, trotted out people, go out there for scale in the image. And it turns out that the people looking at an image are going to spend a disproportionate amount of time looking at the humans or the dogs or whatever. And so we recommend that you not do that. We know that you have 10,000 slides like I do that have people in them, and get over it. So like this is the Boar Peak Scarp in Idaho, and you don't need a scale in there, And also when we take close-up pictures of rocks, I have a Sharpie that I scratched the word Sharpie off of it, and I use that marking pen as a scale because it's kind of boring, it's recognizable, you can kind of see what it is. The reason I scratched the word Sharpie, with the eye tracker, we could see students turn their heads and read the word Sharpie on the pen. And we want them looking at the rock, not reading the word Sharpie on the pen.
You can't even use coins because the students will try to read the date on the coin or what country it's from, or what the image is, or is it a quarter or a dime. They spend a lot of time looking at that stuff.
Yep. Okay, so luckily we didn't have to use this kind of data too much, but what this we could put up something on the screen, and we can see the order that students do things in. Like, they're reading along here. Each one of these things is a place where their gaze rested for a microsecond, millisecond, and so we could see, and they're going down, looking at the figure and going back, and at what point they went down to look at the figure and back. So we did a whole bunch of stuff with this. Had a student, Melanie Bush, Melanie Koyen, she's in northern Idaho, northeastern Washington. And so the experiment we did is we took a traditional textbook where you got a bunch of columns of text, and then you put the figure at the end. And that's a lot of times, how textbooks get done. The author writes a bunch of text, and then they kind of, well, we need a picture of a giraffe. Well, we got room for it here. We'll put it in there. And we said, well, let's do it like a traditional textbook, but a best case scenario, we'll put the figure right in the center, because we already knew that students looked in the center of the image. And every paragraph had like an A, B, that was specifically numbered in here. You can't see it here. But the way Julie and I think it ought to be done is you have these separated text blocks, and you have leaders that point to the specific thing. So the student doesn't have to say, oh, that's point A, and I have to look over here on the figure for point A. That took a little bit of working memory away from you right there. Whereas if you're just pointing, it's like there's no processing involved. And so we did these three ways of doing things, and then we gave them a pre-test and a post-test. And the students learned more from an integrated text and figure approach than they did from a traditional approach. And this intermediate reference best case scenario thing was intermediate. But this was a big statistical difference between these two. And we're not the first people who've done this experiment, but it shows really clearly that if you integrate your text and your figure, students or employees, trainees, whatever, will learn more. And so this gets back to that question about breaking up the text with the figures. We want to do that. Okay, so there's a guy named Richard Mayer who's he's probably retired by now, UC Santa Barbara. And he did a bunch of simple little experiments, and they redid it over and over again. They had a figure with a figure caption underneath it, or they did the exact same thing, but they put the text up in the figure. And then they gave a pre-test and a post-test, both for recall, and they gave them a test that illustrated how well they could use the information. Like, how could you make more clouds? What would you need to do? And so the things I'm showing you is this thing that's called the transfer test. Can you use it? And so if the students had the integrated, it was just this simple change, the students did better at problem solving with that information than they did if they got separated text and illustration. And you'd say, it can't be that big of a difference, but he did this experiment with class after class after class, and he generated a ton of data, and we duplicated his results. Again, if you can integrate the text and the figures, it's better. And he did a number of these experiments. He has a little book called Multimedia Learning. And what they did an animation that had narration, because if you think about these two processing systems in our brain, the visual side of thing, the image, is getting information from the eyes, and the text, if you have to read it, it has to come through the eyes as well. But if you hear it, it comes through your ears. So you've kind of separated those two inputs into your system. What he said is, let's do animation with narration, and let's do that, but then we're going to show the same text like a figure caption or a closed captioning at the same time. And what happened is the redundant text basically overwhelmed your short-term memory, your working memory. And so these students that got more information actually learned less than the students who got only the animation with the narration. And you can argue that animation or an image with narration, like, you put up a picture in a setting and you describe it, graph or a map or a geologic map or a landscape photo, that just simply describing it is maybe the best approach. That's from the standpoint of dual coding these two processing systems in our brain, that's probably the best way to do it. And then they did animation with narration versus animation where the same information was there in text, and the students just were not able to use that information as well after that experience. And again, it's because the text was having to go in through the eyes, and it was competing with the information coming from the animation. So this is how we think you ought to structure material for training of any kind. And so this is the neutral phase of it. And so we're setting up, we're going to talk about El Niños and La Niñas and stuff like that. And so you're talking about the trade winds and, where the warm pool is, a variety of things, the Walker cell. But you can point to every little item and you can say, okay, that's where they're talking about it. So you can learn from this, or imagine learning from this. Well, it's the same information, but now it's in paragraphs. There's no leaders to point to anything. So now you have to just kind of put all this stuff in, and you're having to spend some amount of working memory reconciling the images and the text. Here, you don't have to reconcile the image and the text. That's pointing to the trade winds. But here you have to say, where's the trade winds over the Andes? Okay, that must be over, So gave you a lot. Think about what we just said and how it might impact what you do. And if you have questions, put them in the Q&A or the chat.
We have several comments generally agreeing and commenting that this is really great information.
Good.
Oh, here, I. Lopez says, does it affect the effectiveness of learning if you/we arrange the text in clockwise versus counterclockwise?
That's a hard one. We don't think it frankly makes too much difference, although there's probably a preference for students to read stuff in a clockwise order. If we can put it in a clockwise order, like the one I just showed you, we'll do it. But sometimes you're describing a system and it doesn't make any sense to not only do it in a clockwise order, but sometimes you have to start at the bottom. If you're talking about a rising magma and the depressurization of it as it goes to the surface, you have to start with the magma at the bottom. And so sometimes you have to, and we just say, and in our textbooks, we number those 1, 2, 3, 4. So we tell the students which way, we tell the students what order we want them to read it in.
Bill Turner says, how about using anecdotes to emphasize, I suppose, data or principles?
I think anecdotes are good. They're anecdotes. And so, they are useful examples, but they don't show you. I mean, you sometimes can't convince people with anecdotes. We've just, Phoenix just had its hottest July ever. It must be global warming. I'm sorry, that's an anecdote. Maybe there's global warming involved with it, but it's an anecdote. And so, anecdotes are useful for kind of as an example, I would say, more than anything, rather than trying to convince somebody that that's how things ought to be.
Andy asks, do you have a similar way to present equations and quantitative relationships?
Oh, yeah. We don't have it in here, but I love taking an equation and then describing it like with leaders and explanatory text after it, but saying like, this part of the equation refers to this part of the ideal gas law, and this part refers to this, and this part. Yeah, absolutely. You can do that. It's way fun, actually. Really good.
Let's see, we have several more comments in here, but maybe we ought to run along a little bit.
Okay. So I showed you this picture and I warned you we were going to have it back again. So now I want you to look at this image from the Henry Mountains, and I want you to think about all the manifestations of water, what it's done, where it is, and is there water in this scene that we can't see? So we can see the clouds, and there's two kinds of clouds in here. I just was lucky enough to get cirrus clouds, which are ice crystals versus water drops down here over the Henrys. And there's snow, and you can imagine there's water running down from the melting snow. You can see the rivulets here. That's probably from running water. And of course, there's this green area down here where the horses and cows are. And that's a bunch of gravels that was deposited by river along this stream that's over here at the edge. As far as water that you can't see, of course, there's water coming off from evapotranspiration from the plants. There's water vapor in the air. Water vapor is invisible. And of course, it looks like they're having to irrigate this field. And so there must be groundwater. And the question is, if you wanted somebody to understand all the expressions of groundwater, of water, if you started with a scene like this, it kind of opens up that conversation. And then you could follow that off with something like this. This is what our PowerPoints look like for the textbook. We don't have a single bullet list in our textbook. We're just pointing to things. And it's really just to remind an instructor what to say. And you could then take that scene and you could make it into what is a concept sketch. And Julie is going to kind of take over here.
So you've all heard of concept maps, I guess. And it was clear to us that when we teach, whether it's, in a classroom or in your case, a professional setting, if you can get people to sketch something out, it's going to be more meaningful to them. So we do this in class. When I teach, we do concept sketches almost every day. We'll take some concept and they've got to, take what they know about it and what we've just learned about it and try to turn it into a concept sketch so that they know they understand the process more fully than just reading, disparate pieces of information in a textbook. So this contains a sketch. It contains leaders, just like in the textbook, where whatever the student describes it as, he points to, they point to that part of the sketch where you're talking about it. So it's a kind of a dynamic sort of thing. And then they have to use complete sentences that contain verbs so that they know that you can tell that they understand the process fully. So it's not bullet lists, it's not fragmental sentences, and everything has to, if you're not a good sketcher, use a label and explain, I put this represents a lake, and then you're on your own. And I mean, that is a total, all the elements that are involved in a concept sketch. So you have to teach people how to do concept sketches, but it helps build this full understanding of the concept. And here's one that we have, I think this is in the textbook, that, it shows students how to actually put together a concept sketch. And I know in an environment where you are, you'd have to take a few minutes if nobody knew how to do a concept sketch, teach them how to do it. And we do that in the classroom, and it helps build a more cohesive understanding rather than a series of multiple choice questions on an exam. You could just have them do concept sketches that you had picked out. We find all of the pages in our textbook have a before you leave this page, and it often involves sketching. So if you were really reading this textbook and doing exactly what you were asked to do, you'd get done with that 2-page spread and you would stop and you'd draw a simple little sketch of some process that you just learned. And based on that, you would be able to understand, at least the theory is that you'd be able to understand it. I have to tell you, I use concept sketches only for my exams. So I give the students a list of specific concept sketches. It says sketch, label, and explain, and then describe what process they need to worry about. They go home, they practice those sketches, and then they show up for the exam. I pick 2 at random, and they have to do that during class time. And this is
an example concept sketch from that last question. There's 3 kinds of, what angular nonconformity, nonconformity, disconformity. And this is an example of what a student did in a portfolio where they actually turned it in.
We used to get questions all the time from students about, I practice these sketches so often, can I get some credit for that in preparation for the exam? And so if the class is small enough, we actually have them keep a separate notebook where they do practice, if you will, all of their sketches.
And just a time check, we're 10 minutes to the top of the hour.
All
Yeah.
right. So this is how we do assessments. Yeah. So this is a typical concept sketch list, from an exam. We usually have some amount of information that they have to provide us. It tells them exactly what part of the book we want them to look at. And they are to prepare for the exam by answering these questions at home. And that's where we got into the portfolios, was because there were some number of students who were spent enormous amount of times preparing for the exam. Number one, they knew exactly what was going to be on the exam rather than multiple choice questions. And they wanted to prepare for it because they could. Eventually, like I say, we had a lot of students who wanted credit for all the hard work they'd done. So we started doing things, something called a portfolio, where if they answered every single concept sketch question that we had given them for the exam in a notebook, then they would get extra points for those. And here's some examples of those. I don't know if this is an exam or a portfolio. But it must be a portfolio.
Yeah.
The only restriction is that they cannot copy the words from the textbook. That's plagiarism. So they have to use their own language to describe the processes that are going on.
And so that's about latent heat. And the next one, it shows two different examples of the same answer. I mean, answering the same question, but two different ways.
Yes. So you get lots of variation. Students, might look things up on the internet and want to draw their own sketch, and that's totally fine.
So this is one about seasons, why we have seasons. This is one about, atmospheric ocean circulations. Night breeze, day breezes. One of the classes Julie and I teach, it's called Earth Solar System Universe. And we said, could you have left something out? But we have to teach astronomy in it too. We get to teach astronomy in it. All right. So this is like a low mass star. One of the things that this process does is concept sketches fill a niche that a lot of people don't have. That how do you teach, learn, and assess in-depth understanding of systems? And if you can do a concept sketch of evolution of a low mass star like this, you understand it because you had to. When people look at Bloom's taxonomy, there's a whole bunch of different levels, but one of them is synthesis. And if you have to read a complicated textbook and put it in your own words, you've done a pretty high level activity in a Bloom's taxonomy. We have the students read the textbook, and then they have online quizzes. We do these exams or portfolios that are concept sketches, so that's the depth. And then if you have students do some other problem solving things, we end every one of our chapters with investigation. A lot of us, whether you're teaching students or teaching employees, you're deciding how much depth do I cover, how much breadth do I cover, and how do I teach them to problem solve? And we think with this kind of approach, you can actually do all three. So the reason to use concept sketches, it engages both of our processing systems, and it's less likely to overload working memory. And you're more likely to recall information if you have what's called multiple representations. If you have pictures and words linked in your brain, you're more likely to remember that stuff. That's it. What are your questions?
Thank you, guys. That's amazing. And I'm only sad that we have only 5 minutes to the top of the hour, because I feel like we could talk about this all day. Let me go back to a question that I missed that Darius brought up. I am a consultant. We tend to put figures in a whole separate section. In a textbook, your layout makes sense. Would you suggest this layout in a technical report? Do you use this layout in papers?
I am a consultant. I do lots of consulting to help people find all kinds of things, water, lithium, you name it. And this is exactly how I do things, because it's gonna be clearer for the people reading the report. You say, here's this example of these fractures that are localizing the mineralization, and you have the picture right there. And as opposed to, you have this kind of almost like an appendix of figures. So yeah, it depends what you're doing. Sometimes, you have like big, contour data sets and stuff like that. you really can't integrate that very easily in with text. So you just have to do what you have to do.
Yeah, Lopez comments that this will be very useful at preparing presentations going forward. And Chris mentioned that concept sketching might work for our state lead abatement supervisor exams also, for setup, abatement, and cleanup processes.
There
Thank
you
you.
go.
I've been looking
I
for
like
an
that.
alternative to multiple choice.
Yeah, and you know, if you're having trouble understanding some topic, force yourself to try to draw a concept sketch, because you have to read all the information. You have to figure out what's important and what's not, both from the standpoint of the words, but also from the standpoint of how you would show it in a picture, in a figure, like a sketch. And so, you know, both of those processes are kind of asking you to disembed more complicated stuff and say, what's the essence of this? Like, you know, we could have shown a really fancy mid-ocean ridge picture, but that little sketch we did that shows the evolution, it just said, well, you have to show the pillow basalts, you have to show the hydrothermal vents, and you know, but you have to decide what's important and what's not. So if you're having trouble understanding something, try to force yourself to do a concept sketch of it. If you have employees or trainees that are having trouble understanding something, make them do concept sketches.
Steve and Julia, would you be willing to share contact information for those who may have questions for you?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. If you want to type things in the chat box, feel free, or you could get it to me later if you'd prefer. All right, and another comment, fascinating presentation. Thanks, a lot to think about.
Thanks
Okay.
for having
Well,
us.
thanks for having
Oh,
us.
one more. Oh, one more. Any tips on representing geological maps, presenting a geological map?
Yeah, it's a little harder. You know, you almost have to do like an overlay kind of a thing of it. I compiled the geologic map of Arizona. When I did that, I would take a sheet of tracing paper and I would overlay it on the geologic map, and then I would mark faults with a big marking pen and little contacts with a Sharpie. And then I would annotate what those things were, actually writing words on the map. And then back there, we didn't have ways to, I actually had to photo reduce things with a copy machine to get them down to the scale. It's before GIS and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm old. And so I basically made what you might consider to be a concept sketch. Is long a time before we invented the term concept sketch and the whole concept of it. But I basically had that overlay. So you know, essentially I had, you know, like I said, you know, this fault has 500 feet of west side down movement, and this anticline is thought to be over, you know, whatever. And so that's a really interesting thing to force yourself to do to a geologic map, is just to try to extract what's the essence of it, what the big parts are. And you don't want to just duplicate it. So you have to lump things, and you have to consolidate things, and you have to say, those faults are little, I don't care about them. That fault's big, I care about that. So you can do it, but it's a little harder, but that's one strategy. And that, you know, when I did the geologic map of Arizona, that helped me a ton with understanding the geology of a quadrangle, because I had to really basically I did a disembedding experiment with it. You know, I had to say what's important and what's not. And that's disembedding. I didn't know what it was called back then, but that's what I did. Okay, so
that's great. But yeah, we have comments of just thanking for a great presentation and useful information they plan on using for all kinds of different purposes here. And we just really appreciate your time and the presentation, both Steve and Julia. Thank you so much.
Okay, we're glad to help. And Julie and I, it's a Johnson and Reynolds paper in Journal of Geoscience Education on concept sketches. So if you want to read about them and what we think about them, that's a way to do it. And
Okay.
Otherwise, we'll go, and thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.